In 1985, America sat 5 finance ministers down in a New York hotel room and quietly dismantled the Japanese economic miracle. It worked, and in doing so, it accidentally built China's. Most people think China's rise was about cheap labor, communist planning, or strategic patience, but the real story starts not in Beijing, it starts in a deal America made to punish Japan. A deal so effective, so brutal in its financial logic that it triggered a chain reaction no one in Washington fully anticipated. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history, and remember, simple is never easy.
To understand what happened, you have to go back to the early 1980s. America was in trouble. Not militarily, it still owned that, but economically, it was bleeding. The trade deficit with Japan had become a national wound. Japanese cars filled American driveways. Japanese televisions sat in American living rooms. Japanese steel undercut American factories. Detroit was hollowing out. Pittsburgh was going quiet. And Congress was furious. Japan had done something remarkable. After the devastation of World War II, it had rebuilt itself into the world's second-largest economy in less than 30 years. Its export machine ran on precision, discipline, and one critical advantage, an undervalued currency. The yen was cheap. That made Japanese goods irresistibly affordable, and American manufacturers simply couldn't compete. By 1985, the U.S. trade deficit with Japan had climbed to over $50 billion a year in a single year, and the pressure to respond had become impossible to ignore. So America reached for a weapon it had used before, not a missile, not a tariff, something quieter and far more devastating, a currency agreement. The weapon had a polite name, the Plaza Accord. In September 1985, the finance ministers and central bank governors of 5 nations, the United States, West Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Japan, gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The meeting was barely publicized, no cameras, no crowds, just 5 men and a shared understanding that the global financial order needed adjusting. The agreement they signed that day required coordinated intervention in currency markets. The goal was straightforward: force the dollar down and force the yen up. Make Japanese goods expensive, give American manufacturers room to breathe. What followed was one of the most dramatic currency shifts in modern history. In less than 2 years, the yen nearly doubled in value against the dollar. Products that Japanese exporters had sold competitively around the world suddenly cost twice as much. Profit margins collapsed overnight. Companies that had spent decades building export empires found their entire business model had been repriced by a handshake in a hotel ballroom. America had done exactly what it intended to do. Japan's export advantage was gone. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one in that room had mapped out. When the yen doubled in value, Japanese manufacturers faced a choice. They could absorb the cost and accept thinner margins, which was not sustainable. Or they could move production somewhere cheaper, somewhere the currency was still low, somewhere wages were still manageable. They chose to move, and the country they moved to was China. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Japanese companies began relocating factories, supply chains, and manufacturing operations across the East China Sea. Sony, Toyota, Panasonic, Toshiba, hundreds of smaller suppliers followed. They brought capital, technology, industrial knowledge, and organizational systems that China's economy had never seen at that scale. They weren't doing China a favor, they were solving their own survival problem. But the effect was the same: an enormous transfer of industrial capability into Chinese hands. And here is the detail that changes everything. While Japan was forced to revalue its currency upward, China was not. The renminbi stayed anchored, carefully managed, deliberately cheap. Beijing watched what happened to Japan and drew the sharpest possible lesson: never let a foreign power dictate the value of your money. Japan had surrendered monetary sovereignty under pressure. China never would. Meanwhile, Japan's domestic economy was unraveling in slow motion. Facing falling export revenues, the Japanese government tried to stimulate growth at home. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates. Credit flooded the economy. And that cheap money went somewhere it always goes when it has nowhere productive to flow: into assets. Japanese real estate and stock prices exploded. The Nikkei stock index tripled between 1985 and 1989. Land in Tokyo became, at its peak, worth more per square foot than anywhere else on Earth. The Imperial Palace grounds were theoretically valued at more than all of California. It was a bubble, magnificent, irrational, and doomed. In 1989, the Bank of Japan raised rates to cool the overheating economy. The bubble burst. Real estate values collapsed. Banks, loaded with loans backed by inflated property, began to fail. Corporate balance sheets froze. Consumers stopped spending. The economy that had terrified America for a decade went quiet. Japan entered what economists would later call the lost decade, a prolonged period of stagnation, deflation, and structural paralysis that lasted not 10 years, but 20. Some would argue it has never fully ended. And while Japan was contracting, China was compounding. Every year that passed, more Japanese and Taiwanese and South Korean manufacturers were moving operations into China. Western companies followed, not just to avoid currency exposure, but because Chinese labor was genuinely cheap, infrastructure was improving fast, and the government was openly offering subsidies, tax breaks, and land deals to attract foreign capital. The lesson of Japan's collapse was not lost on Beijing. China did not liberalize its capital account. It did not allow foreign speculators to pressure its currency. It kept the renminbi undervalued for decades, explicitly, deliberately, as policy. What Japan had been forced to give up, China quietly protected. And because the renminbi stayed cheap, the same dynamic that had once made Japan's exports unstoppable now worked in China's favor. Cheap currency, competitive prices, a manufacturing machine that nobody in the world could match on cost. By 2001, China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, a move championed largely by the United States under the belief that economic integration would liberalize Chinese society. What it actually did was give China preferential access to the same global markets that Japan had once dominated. The $50 billion trade deficit America had with Japan in 1985, by 2023, the annual trade deficit with China had reached over $280 billion. The weapon America used against Japan had not only destroyed Japan's advantage, it had handed the blueprint directly to China. The Plaza Accord was not malicious toward China. China wasn't even the subject of the meeting. But financial interventions of that scale don't stay contained. They ripple outward in ways that policymakers rarely trace. Japan's forced revaluation restructured the entire geography of Asian manufacturing. It pushed capital and technology toward China at precisely the moment China was building the political and physical infrastructure to absorb it. And China's refusal to make the same monetary concession Japan had made ensured that the advantage, once transferred, would be permanent. Japan never fully recovered the industrial position it held before 1985. Its demographics aged, its debt compounded, and its corporate culture never fully adapted. The country that once threatened to outcompete America in every manufacturing category became a cautionary exhibit in economic history. China, meanwhile, became the factory of the world, not by accident, not by ideology alone, but by absorbing Japan's industrial capacity, learning from Japan's monetary mistake, and building a financial system specifically designed to resist the kind of pressure that had broken Tokyo.
There is a brutal irony buried in all of this. The financial weapon America designed to protect its own industries ended up accelerating the rise of a far more formidable competitor. The agreement that was supposed to defend Detroit gave China its industrial foundation. The currency pressure that was meant to stabilize American trade taught Beijing exactly how monetary sovereignty is worth protecting at any cost. Financial interventions don't end at the border, their intended target. They travel, they find unintended recipients, and the consequences follow a logic that no committee in a hotel room can fully foresee. The economy of Japan's lost decades, the factories of China's rise, the trade deficits that define American politics today, all of it traces back to one September afternoon in New York. One agreement, one miscalculation. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how financial power reshapes the world, not with armies, but with exchange rates, it becomes much harder to believe that any of this was accidental. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. It's financial system, and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.